Good afternoon, everyone. I wanted to talk for just a few minutes about Auden's poem Musée des Beaux-Arts. If you want to go ahead and go to the readings in the introduction module and pull it up, it might be easier to follow along if you've got it in front of you. So one of the things I wanted to bring up with this poem is paying attention to pronouns, which will help you with a lot of poetry. So if you notice in the very first line of the poem, we have about suffering, they were never wrong. So who's the they? A lot of times you'll find that poetry, and I think this is what can make it difficult for us, the syntax is often mixed up, right? So it's not written in normal order of words that we're used to. So in order to figure out who the they is, we have to actually look at the next line where it says, the old masters, how well they understood. So now we're beginning to understand that in that first line, he's talking about the old masters. And if you read some of the background to the poem, you'll know he's in an art museum. And so by old masters, he means, really well-known, reputed artists. And so he's beginning to get us to think about how they are depicting suffering. And then if you notice in the third line, we have another pronoun, its human position, how it takes place. And these first few lines are really central to establishing what this whole poem is about. So if we don't know who what the it is, we'll be very kind of left out and confused. So if I just read the first three lines again, see if you can pick up on where we can draw a connection between another word in those three lines and the it, so we can identify what that is. About suffering, they were never wrong, the old masters. How well they understood its human position, how it takes place while someone else is eating or opening a window. So hopefully you heard there that suffering is what it refers to. So then everything else in that first stanza is giving depictions of suffering and how it happens kind of alongside these normal everyday activities, how some people are just oblivious to it happening. It means a lot, suffering means a lot to one person, but not to someone else. And then he mixes this idea of the martyr, right, which we hold up martyrs, we idealize them because they suffered for a cause. So he sort of mashes that idealization right up against these really ordinary and even what's the word I'm looking for here? Not nice images. So, dogs, doggy life, a horse scratching its butt on a tree, right? So these really sort of almost, ordinary things that are happening alongside suffering. So kind of making suffering not seem as idealized, that in fact it probably feels quite different than that idealized version that we think of with martyrs. And then in the second stanza is where he starts talking about the painting that kind of helped inspire this poem. And so one thing that I want you to think about in the second stanza, and another thing about poetry that I wanted to kind of explain to you guys using Auden's poem, is the power of adjectives, right? And so if we look at the second line of the second stanza, where it says, quite leisurely from the disaster, and then in the third line, that word forsaken, cry. And so what I want you to begin to think about is how those adjectives help us to think about the action or the thing differently. So and sometimes these are adverbs too, of course. But if we read the first three lines of the second stanza, just to kind of get the whole sentence in there. In Bruegel's Icarus, for instance, how everything turns away quite leisurely from the disaster. The plowman may have heard the splash, the forsaken cry, but for him it was not an important failure. So not only is it a cry that he hears, but it's a forsaken cry. So if you're trying to think about how is Auden representing suffering by thinking about this painting and by writing about it, that act of forsaking, right, gives a lot of agency to the people who are ignoring the suffering or turning away from it or forsaking it, right? This also could, for some of you, have biblical allusions, right? With when Jesus says, "Why have you forsaken me?" on the cross. So that word forsaken is really powerful because it's more than just oblivion or obliviousness, right? It's not that these people in the painting are oblivious to Icarus, but it seems like Auden is interpreting them doing something more intentional, a more intentional turning away, right? It's a forsaken cry. I heard it, I acknowledge it, but I'm going to ignore it. I'm forsaking Icarus. Same thing with that word leisurely, right? Turning away leisurely, right? You don't turn away leisurely from a catastrophe, right? You turn away leisurely from something that is ordinary and mundane. And so by giving this attitude to the people in the speaker who are turning away from Icarus as if it doesn't matter, right? As if it's not a big deal. They're leisurely turning away. Again, kind of underscores the disconnect between the sufferer and the people observing the suffering. So I think that disconnect is part of what Auden is getting at too. So notice how just paying attention to a few key words really helps you understand how Auden is thinking about suffering. So that's kind of what I wanted you to think about through this video, and then hopefully you can take that and notice some other words that really stand out to you. And also remember that principle of figuring out what pronouns refer to will really help you with poetry.